identical products. There's no barriers to entry. These are like the 3 assumptions. And we talked about monopoly, where there's just one firm offering that product. In perfectly competitive markets, no firms had the ability to set their own prices because they had no way to differentiate their goods from other firms. So if they would raise their prices, other firms would just, or consumers would just buy from other firms. So there's no reason, there's no ability to raise their prices. But basically what we saw was competition just on who could lower their price down to the marginal cost. What we saw in monopolies is these firms have market power because there's no other firms that are offering this product. So they could sell it above marginal cost. Now we're going to move on to monopolistic competition, which has some features for both of those. So it's the many firms and the identical products in the perfectly competitive market that imply this horizontal demand curve. So no matter what, they're going to keep it at that price. That's the market price. And because there's no barriers to entry for new firms entering the industry, there's going to be no long-run profit. So for monopolistic competition, there are still many firms like there was in perfect competition. So we're going to have a lot of firms competing within these industries, but they're not going to be selling identical products. They're going to be selling different products. They're going to be able to separate their products somehow from the firms they're competing against. So if you look at like cell phones, you have Apple versus Android versus other competitors. I guess what, under Android you have like Samsung, you've got like Google makes a phone, a bunch of different companies. And there's differences between all these products. And in monopolistic competition, there's no barriers to entry, or very low barriers to entry. So new firms can enter these industries and begin competing. So what this implies to us is that monopolistically competitive firms are going to have zero long-run profits because of the threat of competition. But they're not going to face the horizontal demand curve that we saw in perfect competition. So we talked about monopolies last time, and I think I briefly mentioned A&P when I went through my antitrust rant. Back in the day, A&P grocery store was considered a monopolist. They had 40% of the national market share for grocery sales. So of all the grocery stores in the country, they had 40% of the sales, which is huge compared to any of their competitors. No one was like anywhere near the size of A&P. So a lot of people said, well, they're a monopolist. Look how big they are compared to anyone else. They've got so much market power that there's very little competition in this market. So everyone else is 60% of the market. But it wasn't exactly true, because in each market, even though there's no large firm competing against them, there's several small grocery stores that are competing and offering these same services. So we can still consider this a competitive market, even when we have this one large firm that looks like a monopolist, because they're still facing competition from these other smaller firms. So do you guys agree that in a market where you have a bunch of smaller competing firms, even if you have one large one, that there's still competition present? Does kind of make sense? Do we need other competitors for there to be competitive pressure on a big firm like A&P? If we're in a monopolistically competitive market where there's very low barriers to entry, do we actually need someone competing against them? Or the threat of competition, the threat of someone entering, if there's very low barriers, itself can act as competitive pressure on a firm. They know if they raise their prices too high and act like a monopolist, what's going to happen is other firms are going to begin entering the market and begin competing against them. So if A&P raises their prices too high, a newer chain like Walmart can come in and expand their footprint, offer lower prices than A&P, and either put them out of business, put that store out of business, or force them to lower their prices. So knowing that A&P isn't going to raise their prices too high. Economists often consider perfect competition the standard for competitive market. Like I mentioned before, this really doesn't model the real world very well. In fact, we should be using monopolistic competition as the ideal market, as the best, or I guess the most competitive market. And this model of perfect competition is going to describe the good stuff that economics is trying to understand, and helps model the world way more accurately. So we're looking at how firms act, how they interact with each other, how they compete against each other by trying to offer better goods or cheaper goods. They try to differentiate their products, they try to create new products. Remember, there's no reason to engage in research and development for developing new products in a perfectly competitive market. All you're trying to do is reduce your cost and sell at the lowest price, or bring it down to the market price. Monopolistic competition, there's so much more going on. And this is why I like focusing on this chapter more than the perfect competition chapter. Earlier in the semester, when we were first getting started, I talked about how competition is the discovery process. So it's easy to see how in perfect competition, you don't see this discovery process. So you have firms in monopolistic competition creating these new products, trying to find out what consumers' needs are and what needs aren't being met. So there's room for entrepreneurship in this model, whereas there's not room for entrepreneurship in perfect competition. There's real competition of people and firms offering these new products, changing their design to try to meet consumer needs. This is what happens in the economy, and this is the good stuff that we're trying to figure out. This real competition helps reveal and it helps incentivize firms to meet consumer preferences. So not only does it encourage you to find out what those preferences are, because of the profit motive, because you have some market power where you can charge a higher price than marginal cost, you have this incentive to try to find these and discover these previously unmet needs, and then offer a product that can fill that need. The only reason we know what consumers want is because firms experiment with different products, with different designs and different features. And consumers, they'll either accept or reject those new products and those new services. If a firm comes out with a product with a new feature that consumers really like, they're going to be rewarded. And because other firms see them earning this profit, they're going to begin offering similar goods. They're going to try to use those features in their goods. So we have the profit motive working in monopolistically competitive markets that we don't see in perfect competition. So innovation is more than just competing on price, like it is in perfectly competitive markets. Companies are rivals. They try to beat one another all the time. So they compete on a lot of different dimensions. There's things like product design, try to create, a better product or a new product. You go after performance or quality. Maybe something that's really long-lasting, something that's really durable, something you can drop. I have the Samsung Galaxy S8 Active. The reason I have the active version is because I drop my phone a lot, and it's reinforced. So really durable. That feature was something I needed. Other people don't go for that feature. So we have these consumers with different needs, all having their needs met. Better than you would see if everyone offered the same exact product. Firms are encouraged to try to find cost-cutting technology so they can offer these goods at a lower price. Firms try to make their packaging look better. Maybe to make it more attractive, something that's eye-popping to catch people's eyes as they're looking at the shelves. Maybe they're trying to offer a better description. So instead of just looking at a plain brown box, you actually know what you're getting. They might give you an assurance of the quality of the product. So they give you a warranty or money-back guarantee. You guys ever see Tommy Boy? No one? Something? Oh, man. There's a scene where the guy It's Chris Farley, and he's a fuck up. His dad died, so he used to like take over the brake company, and it's like going out of business. So he's like trying to sell these brake pads, and the one auto parts store was like, well, it doesn't have a guarantee on the box. I don't want to sell it because it doesn't have the guarantee on the box. Then he goes on a weird rant to actually convince him. But all right, your homework this weekend is watch Tommy Boy. The last brand name capital. So firms they invest in loyalty programs to encourage people to keep coming back. That's why your Sheets card, encourages you to keep buying from Sheets. Even if there's another one that's like nearby, you go a little bit farther because you can get the money back or get the points. And over time, if firms offer a good product for whatever reason, whether it's long lasting, whether it's really inexpensive compared to their competitors, whether it's got really high quality or super good performance, if you develop this brand name, consumers know that, then you don't have to advertise as much. It's kind of like free advertising because everyone knows when they associate your company with those characteristics. And it's through this innovation, through this product differentiation, where they're trying to make their products different from their competitors, that firms get this monopoly power. And they're trying to get those monopoly profits, which remember is going to be higher than a firm in perfect competition. So sometimes firms grow to monopoly because there's these big barriers to entry. And maybe they're a natural monopoly that only one firm can efficiently operate in a region. Maybe there's some government protection they have that limits people entering. Whatever reason, those tend to be bad for consumers. But if firms grow to near monopoly because they're superior products that they're offering, that's a good thing for consumers, especially when they're doing so at a lower price. So people are afraid that Amazon is a monopoly, and no firms can compete against them because they offer goods so cheap. But the fact that they're offering goods so cheap is good for consumers. And they still have that competitive pressure of other firms that can begin entering and selling online. As long as we keep the barriers to entry low for that industry, then we have some competitive pressure on Amazon, even when there's no or very few, very small competitors against them. And when you develop these new products, something that gives you monopoly power and monopoly profits, when there's no barriers to entry or very low barriers to entry, firms have to keep at it. They can't just stop like a real monopolist can. They have to keep innovating, keep trying to meet consumer needs. Or else other firms are going to enter the industry. Other firms are going to begin competing away those profits because they're offering a similar good or a better good. Now, firms try to take advantage of their monopoly power, and they try to raise prices when they've got this one differentiated good that no one else is offering. What they're going to have to do is sacrifice sales. Under perfect competition, remember, they're going to lose all their sales. Monopolistic competition is more like monopoly, so we have this downward sloping demand curve. And that's because they've created some narrow monopoly. They're the only firm that has those types of features for their product. So for definition of monopolistic competition, this is a market structure where barriers to entry are going to be very low. And many firms are going to compete by selling similar but not identical products. But you can consider all the cell phones being offered fairly similar. They do a lot of the same things, but they have these different characteristics that cell phone manufacturers use to differentiate them from one another. And they all meet different consumer needs. So what it has is the features of monopoly and the features of perfect competition. So look at Chipotle. There's a lot of companies, a lot of restaurants that sell burritos and compete in that market. But those competitors all have slightly different burritos. Some of them don't let you make it. You don't get to pick them all the different ingredients right in front of you. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. different types of restaurant, like different like style restaurants. Some take a little bit longer to get it, some are like a little quicker. So there's different characteristics for all of these different firms that are, or restaurants that are selling burritos. Off on the outside, they may look very close to being the same. There's some differences there, and they meet different consumer needs. Yeah. So here's our demand curve for Chipotle. So some consumers are going to have a preference for Chipotle burritos because of something about the store. So Chipotle raises its prices because of this market power. They've been able to differentiate their product enough. When they raise their price, some of the consumers are going to switch to other restaurants, but not all the consumers are going to switch. Because of this different products from other firms, some are going to be willing to pay the higher price. So that's why we have this downward sloping demand curve, like we see in normal markets and like we saw in Monopoly. So when Chipotle is trying to figure out where to price their burritos, they have to think of the trade-off between the increased revenue per burrito they're going to make versus the loss of consumers. But to figure out which is going to be higher, and whether it's worth it or not. All right, so let's go back to the demand, the marginal revenue, total revenue, this boring slide that shows everything. What we see here is as Chipotle increases their price from $4.50 up to $10, they're going to sell fewer and fewer burritos. That's our downward sloping demand curve. What we see our total revenue is going to increase for most of it, but even at the end we see a slight decrease as they start decreasing their prices. Even though they're increasing their sales, at some point they're going to start making less money. Their average revenue just decreases the whole time, and our marginal revenue decreases and even goes negative at the end. Because we see the total revenue drops from $50 to $49.50. So just like before, we're going to use these to create the market curves. So let's look at an example where Chipotle reduces their prices of a burrito by, we can call it 50 cents, and they'll sell one additional burrito. So again, this additional sale they're making, going from 5 sales to 6 sales, is going to be an increase in revenue. But at the same time, their revenue is going to decrease from the lower price they're getting per burrito. So there's the output effect. The output effect, when you lower the price, you're going to sell more units. And then there's the revenue effect, that you have a lower revenue per unit when you cut the price. So the marginal revenue for Chipotle in this example is going to be the difference between the red area and the green area. So the output effect minus the price effect. The output effect is going to be equal to the price. So what we're going to see is that marginal revenue is going to be lower than the price. Remember, this is the same thing we saw in the monopoly market. And it's the same basic idea. Because we have this downward sloping demand curve, because we have, as you sell more units, we decrease that price, you're getting a lower price per unit. So the marginal revenue is going to be lower than the demand curve. Here we see same exact thing we saw for a monopolist. We got the marginal revenue curve below the demand curve, again, because of that trade-off. And in this case, after the 10th burrito, when Chipotle lowers their price a little bit further, it's going to result in the revenue decreasing. So we have negative marginal revenue. So initially, the output effect was larger than the price effect because we're seeing this increasing revenue. At that point, the price effect becomes larger than the output effect. So they begin losing money overall if they begin lowering price, even though they're selling more. So again, this is something that monopolistically competitive firms, so most firms out there in industry, they're going to have to consider this. They're going to have to remember this when they're thinking about lowering or raising prices. So just like a perfectly competitive firm, these monopolistically competitive firms are not going to simply try to maximize their revenue. Remember, there's two sides. There's the revenue and there's also the cost that they face. So every time they produce an additional unit, they're going to have some marginal cost from that production. So if they want to maximize their profit, they're going to have to produce until the marginal revenue from the last unit is equal to the marginal cost of that last unit. So again, for the third time, we produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I told you with, I think it was during perfect competition, that this is going to be a theme through all these markets. You compete or you produce where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So all firms that can adjust their output by just a few units, they're going to use this rule. So it's going to be true for perfectly competitive markets, monopolistic markets, and monopolistically competitive markets. All right, it's been a half hour. You guys look forward to shit on this Friday morning. I'm not gonna lie.